Some people think a gate is just a piece of wood. They only realize what it was protecting after it's gone. The sharp scream of twisting steel cut through the cool Montana morning before I even poured my first cup of coffee. I froze on my back porch, the smell of fresh-cut pine mixing with diesel exhaust as an excavator wearing my HOA's contractor logo shoved straight through the double barn gates my grandfather had built with his own hands nearly 50 years ago. Thick oak beams cracked under the machine's weight. Iron hinges tore loose from the cedar posts, and splinters scattered across the gravel lane like broken memories. The operator never even looked toward my house. He simply backed away, leaving the entrance wide open before climbing into a white pickup and disappearing down the county road. Then everything became strangely quiet. Too quiet. I set my coffee mug on the porch railing and stared toward the eastern pasture where nearly 60 American bison grazed beyond the rolling hills. They hadn't noticed the missing gates yet, but I'd spent my entire life around those animals. I knew exactly how they thought. One open path was all it took. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 41 years old, and my family has raised bison on this Montana ranch since long before luxury homes and championship golf courses started replacing cattle country. My grandfather always said fences don't keep animals trapped. They guide them where they already want to go. Those old barn gates weren't built to imprison a herd weighing nearly 2,000 pounds apiece. They simply marked the safest route between the grazing fields, the watering ponds, and the winter shelters. Every calf learned that path from the older bulls. Every season followed the same rhythm. Order depended on one pair of gates standing exactly where they belonged. 3 years ago, everything around us changed. Willow Ridge Estates appeared almost overnight. Expensive homes climbed across the neighboring hillsides. Perfectly trimmed fairways stretched over what used to be hay fields, and the HOA promised buyers peaceful country living with championship golf views. Their brochures loved the scenery. They just didn't love the working ranch that created it. Rebecca Collins, the HOA president, had made that clear from the day she introduced herself. She smiled like she was offering friendly advice, but every conversation somehow ended with another suggestion about removing fences, relocating barns, hiding equipment, or making my property look more compatible with the community aesthetic. According to Rebecca, my weathered gates ruined the entrance view for golfers driving the 8th fairway. According to me, they had been standing there decades before anyone imagined building luxury greens beside an active ranch. County records agreed with me, but Rebecca had never been particularly interested in records when she believed appearances mattered more. For months, violation letters arrived in my mailbox complaining about structures that weren't even inside the HOA. Survey crews wandered suspiciously close to my property lines. Contractors measured distances they had no business measuring. I answered every letter politely, saved every document, and kept copies inside a weatherproof file cabinet in my office. My attorney always reminded me of the same thing. Stay patient. Let them make the first real mistake. Standing beside those shattered gates that morning, breathing in the smell of diesel, fresh lumber, and damp earth, I realized they finally had. I did not chase after the contractor. I did not call the excavator back. I simply walked down the gravel lane with my grandfather's old tape measure hanging from my belt, stopping where the broken hinges still clung to the cedar posts. The cool morning breeze carried the sweet smell of prairie grass, and somewhere beyond the ridge a meadowlark sang as if nothing had changed. That contrast always amazes me. Nature rarely panics. People do. I knelt beside one of the shattered gate beams and brushed away fresh sawdust with the back of my hand. Underneath the dust, I found the original branding iron mark my grandfather had burned into the oak in 1978. He used to tell me that every gate on this ranch had a purpose, and if I ever forgot that purpose, the land itself would remind me. At the time, I thought he was talking about cattle. Years later, after we transitioned from cattle to American bison because the native grassland supported them better, I finally understood what he meant. A ranch is not controlled by fences. It is guided by habits. Every trail, every water source, Every feeding station creates invisible patterns that animals trust more than any barrier. Those gates had quietly shaped those patterns for decades. Rebecca Collins never understood that because she had never spent a sunrise watching a herd make decisions together. She saw weathered timber. I saw infrastructure. The county saw it too. Every improvement on my property had been surveyed, permitted where required, and documented long before Willow Ridge Estates existed. My father believed paperwork deserved the same respect as tractors. He kept every deed, survey map, tax receipt, grazing permit, and maintenance record inside steel filing cabinets that still occupied one corner of my office. When he passed away, I inherited more than 800 acres. I inherited a complete history of every fence line and every property improvement stretching back nearly 60 years. Most people think ranching is about strong backs and long days. They rarely see the endless paperwork that protects everything you build. Around 8 o'clock that morning, I unlocked the office, flipped on the old brass desk lamp, and opened the cabinet labeled Boundary Improvements. The familiar smell of aging paper and leather folders filled the room. Inside sat photographs taken after every major repair, engineering sketches showing gate placement, invoices from local welders, and inspection reports signed by county officials. I placed the newest photographs from my phone beside the older records and quietly added today's date to a fresh folder. Every broken hinge, every damaged post, every tire track. Years ago, my father taught me never to argue with someone who ignores facts. Instead, collect more facts than they know exist. Outside the office window, I noticed movement on the distant hillside. The lead bull had lifted his massive head. His dark eyes stayed fixed on the opening where the gates had stood only an hour earlier. The younger animals slowly followed his gaze, almost as if they sensed that something familiar had disappeared. I felt my stomach tighten, not because I feared the herd, but because I knew routines can change faster than people imagine when someone carelessly removes the one structure holding those routines together. By noon, my phone finally rang, and the name on the screen surprised absolutely no one. Rebecca Collins never wasted an opportunity to sound confident when she believed she had already won. I answered, switched the call to speaker, and continued organizing the photographs on my desk. Her voice carried that polished sweetness real estate agents seem to master after years of convincing people that expensive decisions are easy ones. Ethan, I just wanted to let you know the old gates were removed as part of a community access improvement. You're welcome. I looked through the office window toward the empty entrance and smiled without making a sound. Community access to whose property? I asked. There was a brief pause before she answered. Your entrance was creating a visual obstruction beside our golf course. The board agreed it would improve neighborhood appearance. She said neighborhood as though my ranch had somehow become an unwanted guest on land my family owned decades before her subdivision existed. I thanked her for the information, ended the call, and saved the recording. It was not illegal in my state because she had willingly participated in the conversation, and experience had taught me that confident people often provide the strongest evidence against themselves. Rebecca always believed authority came from a printed logo at the top of expensive stationery. Every letter she mailed carried the Willow Ridge Estates seal, paragraphs of formal language, and just enough confidence to intimidate homeowners who did not know where HOA authority ended. Unfortunately for her, my property had never been inside those boundaries. She knew it. I knew it. The county survey maps proved it. That never seemed to slow her down. About an hour later, I drove toward the clubhouse to see what they had done from the other side. The paved cart paths curved through perfectly trimmed fairways so green they almost looked artificial against the golden Montana hills. Automatic sprinklers clicked back and forth with mechanical precision while golfers quietly practiced short putts under cloudless skies. Everything looked carefully controlled. Rebecca stood near the maintenance building wearing a crisp white polo embroidered with the HOA logo, greeting contractors with the confidence of someone directing a major construction project. When she noticed my truck, she walked over carrying a clipboard tucked beneath one arm. Her smile never reached her eyes. Looks much better already, does it not? She asked while gesturing toward the open entrance. I glanced past her toward the distant ridgeline where my pastures stretched beyond the golf course. It certainly looks different, I replied. She nodded proudly. Sometimes people become attached to outdated structures. Progress requires difficult decisions. I almost laughed at the irony. She believed progress meant removing obstacles. I knew those gates had never been obstacles. They were part of a carefully balanced system that had quietly worked every single day for nearly half a century. Rebecca mistook experience for stubbornness because she had only lived beside working land for 3 years. She admired mountain views through clubhouse windows, but had never learned how the landscape actually functioned. As I climbed back into my truck, a warm gust carried the scent of dry grass across the valley. Far beyond the fairways, barely visible against the rolling hills, the lead bull had begun walking toward the opening. The rest of the herd slowly fell into line behind him with the calm certainty that only comes from following a path they had trusted their entire lives. The afternoon sun settled low enough to cast long shadows across the pasture, turning every fence post into a dark line stretching through the golden grass. I parked my truck beside the old equipment shed and walked toward the broken entrance one more time. The smell of sun-baked cedar mixed with fresh dirt where the excavator tracks had chewed across the ground that morning. Nothing about the opening looked accidental anymore. The tire marks were clean. The gate hardware had been stacked neatly to one side. Someone had planned this, completed it, and left believing the job was finished. They had no idea they had only started something much larger. I pulled my phone from my pocket and made 3 calls in a row. The first went to my attorney, Daniel Harper. I explained exactly what had happened without exaggerating a single detail. He listened quietly before saying the words I expected. Do not rebuild anything yet. Photograph every change. Preserve the scene exactly as it is. The second call went to my insurance representative. She opened a claim, documented the property damage, and asked whether the area had become unsafe. I answered honestly, not yet. My final call went to the county wildlife office. The dispatcher recognized my name immediately because our ranch had participated in several conservation programs over the years. I reported that a primary livestock control gate had been removed without authorization and requested that the incident be documented. The officer on duty promised to stop by before sunset. I thanked him and hung up. Then I waited. Waiting is something ranching teaches better than almost any profession. You cannot rush weather. You cannot rush seasons. You certainly cannot rush animals that have followed the same routine for generations. Around 5 o'clock, I climbed onto the observation platform overlooking the east pasture with a pair of binoculars my father bought when I was a teenager. The wind had shifted, carrying the earthy scent of dry prairie and distant sagebrush across the valley. Below me, the herd grazed peacefully, completely unaware that the familiar route separating one section of the ranch from another had suddenly changed. The lead bull eventually stopped feeding. He raised his massive head, sniffed the air, and slowly turned toward the missing entrance. One by one, the others noticed him. No panique, no confusión, just quiet curiosity. That was how experienced animals behaved. They investigated changes before accepting them. I lowered the binoculars and looked across the property line toward the golf course. Electric maintenance carts rolled from green to green while groundskeepers carefully trimmed the edges of sand bunkers with almost surgical precision. Sprinklers hissed in perfect rhythm. Everything operated according to schedule. It struck me that both the ranch and the golf course depended on routine. The difference was that mine had evolved naturally over decades, while theirs depended entirely on people maintaining the illusion of control. Just before sunset, the county wildlife officer arrived in a dusty pickup. He examined the broken posts, took measurements, photographed the damage, and quietly shook his head. Whoever removed these gates probably thought they were solving a landscaping problem, he said. I nodded without taking my eyes off the distant herd. I have a feeling they misunderstood what these gates were actually doing. He followed my gaze toward the slowly gathering bison and remained silent for several long seconds before answering. I think you were right, and I think someone else is about to learn that lesson the expensive way. The next morning arrived with the kind of silence that usually means the ranch is working exactly as it should. A thin layer of dew covered the prairie grass, and the cool air carried the familiar scent of damp earth mixed with wild sage. I stood on the same observation platform before sunrise, coffee warming my hands while the first rays of light reached across the valley. The opening where my gates had stood remained untouched. I had every board, every hinge, and every damaged bolt exactly where the county officer documented them the night before. Nothing had been moved because evidence loses its value the moment someone changes the scene. Around 7 o'clock, the herd began its usual routine. The lead bull walked slowly toward the eastern pasture with calm confidence, followed by the older cows and then the younger animals. There was no rushing, no confusión. They simply followed the route generations before them had followed. Except this time, when they reached the place where the gates had always guided them, there was nothing left to guide them at all. They paused for several moments, sniffing the morning air while the breeze drifted toward the neighboring golf course. I watched through my binoculars as the lead bull took a few careful steps through the open entrance. The others naturally followed behind him. That was not rebellion. That was instinct. Rebecca had believed those gates were decorative. She had unknowingly removed the one visual and physical guide the herd relied upon every single day. I picked up my phone and called the county wildlife officer before anything else happened. The herd has begun moving through the damaged entrance, I reported calmly. I wanted you notified immediately. He thanked me for calling first and assured me that his department was already aware of the documented property damage from the previous evening. After ending the call, I contacted Daniel Harper and my insurance representative as well. Every conversation was logged with exact times because facts matter far more than dramatic stories once lawyers become involved. From my position on the ridge, I could see maintenance crews preparing the golf course for another busy day. Golf carts lined up outside the clubhouse, flags fluttered gently above freshly cut greens, and automatic sprinklers finished their final rotation before the first players arrived. Everything looked perfectly ordinary from a distance. That illusion lasted only a few minutes. The lead bull continued walking exactly where decades of habit and the morning breeze encouraged him to go. One after another, the rest of the herd followed with quiet confidence, never running, never showing signs of distress, simply exploring the open path that should never have existed. I felt no satisfaction watching it unfold, only certainty. Every decision has consequences, especially when someone interferes with systems they never bothered to understand. My grandfather once told me that nature does not care about property values, neighborhood image, or expensive landscaping. It follows its own rules whether people respect them or not. Standing on that ridge with the cool wind against my face, I finally understood why he repeated those words so often. Rebecca believed she had removed an inconvenience. What she had actually removed was the only boundary quietly keeping two completely different worlds operating in harmony. By the time the first golfers reached the 8th fairway, the morning still looked perfectly ordinary from their perspective. Sunlight shimmered across the freshly watered grass. Sprinkler heads disappeared beneath the turf one by one, and the distant mountains framed the course exactly the way the real estate brochures promised. From my ridge, however, I could already see something different unfolding. The lead bull continued walking with slow confidence through the opening where my gates had once stood. Every few yards he stopped, lifted his head, and tested the breeze before moving forward again. The rest of the herd mirrored every decision he made with quiet precision. That was how experienced animals protected one another. They trusted the oldest member to choose the safest path. Unfortunately for everyone involved, the path they trusted no longer ended where it had for nearly 50 years. My phone vibrated with a text from Daniel Harper asking for an update. I replied with a single photograph taken through my binoculars showing the open entrance exactly as the county officer had documented it. A minute later he responded, "Preserve everything. Do not interfere unless there is an immediate safety emergency." Those words matched exactly what I had already planned. Ranchers spend their lives managing situations without creating unnecessary panic. My responsibility was to cooperate with the proper authorities, not to create headlines. Minutes later, another county wildlife truck arrived near the property line. Officer Ryan Mitchell stepped out carrying a camera and notebook before climbing the ridge beside me. We watched in silence as the herd continued its slow movement. He recorded the time, weather conditions, wind direction, and the exact location of the damaged entrance before taking dozens of photographs from multiple angles. Every report needs a complete timeline, he said quietly while writing in his notebook. People remember emotions. Courts remember documentation. I appreciated hearing someone else speak the same language my father had taught me. Across the valley, activity around the clubhouse continued as though nothing unusual existed beyond the decorative fences surrounding the golf course. Groundskeepers loaded equipment onto utility carts. Maintenance staff adjusted flag positions on several greens, and early players laughed while practicing short putts outside the pro shop. Rebecca Collins stood near the entrance, greeting residents with the same polished confidence she always carried. She had absolutely no reason to suspect that removing one pair of weathered ranch gates had quietly altered the daily movement of nearly 60 animals that had followed identical routines for generations. Then Officer Mitchell lowered his binoculars and pointed toward the shallow drainage crossing between my pasture and the edge of the course. "That is where they are headed," he said. I nodded because I already knew. The drainage had always been blocked by the gates and adjoining fence line, gently guiding the herd toward the eastern grazing fields instead. Without that visual boundary, the natural contour of the land encouraged them to continue straight ahead. No one had trained them to do it. Gravity, habit, and open space were doing all the work. I took a slow breath, smelling warm prairie grass carried on the strengthening wind, and realized that everything my grandfather had spent decades building had been based on understanding the land instead of trying to overpower it. Rebecca believed she had improved the landscape. In reality, she had removed the quiet peace that allowed two neighboring properties with completely different purposes to coexist without ever interfering with one another. The first call from the golf course came just after 9:15 in the morning. I did not answer immediately because I was standing beside Officer Ryan Mitchell while he finished photographing the damaged entrance from 3 different angles. My phone buzzed again, then a third time. When I finally looked down, every missed call carried the same name, Rebecca Collins. Before I could decide whether to return the call, another vehicle climbed the gravel road toward my house. It was a county sheriff's sport utility vehicle, moving at a calm speed instead of the urgency television dramas always portray. Deputy Laura Jensen stepped out, adjusted her hat against the wind, and walked over with a notebook already open. "We received reports that several bison have wandered on a neighboring property," she said. I nodded and pointed toward the broken gate without saying another word. She looked at the shattered posts, the stacked hardware, the county wildlife officer documenting everything, and then quietly wrote several lines before asking her next question. "Who removed the gate?" I handed her printed photographs showing the excavator, the contractor's company logo, and the tire tracks that still marked the ground. Then I played the recording of Rebecca proudly explaining that the gates had been removed as a community improvement. The deputy listened without interrupting. When the recording ended, she closed her notebook for a moment and slowly looked across the valley. Through the morning haze, we could already make out dark shapes moving across the rolling edge of the golf course. The animals were not running. They were simply following one another with the same patient rhythm they had used every day on my ranch. Officer Mitchell raised his binoculars again. "The wildlife response team has already been notified," he said. "They will guide the herd back safely once the area is secured." That was exactly what I wanted to hear. Nobody was interested in creating panic. The goal had always been to protect both people and animals while documenting why the situation had occurred in the first place. My phone rang again. This time I answered. Rebecca's polished confidence had completely disappeared. Her voice sounded strained. I could hear distant shouting mixed with golf cart warning horns somewhere behind her. "Ethan, your animals are on our course," she said. I took a slow breath before answering. "Rebecca, they're native wildlife under my permitted ranch management, and they exited through the entrance your contractors removed yesterday." Silence filled the line for several seconds. Finally, she replied, You need to come get them immediately. I looked toward Officer Mitchell before answering because I already knew the correct response. The county wildlife team is handling the situation according to protocol. They requested that no one interfere until they arrive. She started to protest, but I calmly continued. I have followed every instruction from the county, my insurance company, my attorney, and law enforcement since yesterday morning. Another long silence followed. The confidence that had fueled every violation letter, every meeting, and every lecture about community appearance had completely vanished. For the first time since we met, Rebecca sounded like someone realizing that landscaping decisions can carry legal consequences far beyond freshly painted fences and attractive property lines. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, looked once more toward the distant herd, and realized the land was simply doing what it had always done. The only thing that had changed was that someone finally removed the one boundary that quietly kept every piece of it working together. By late morning, the county wildlife team had established a quiet perimeter around the edge of the golf course. There were no flashing scenes of chaos, no dramatic confrontations, just experienced professionals doing exactly what they had trained to do. Rangers coordinated with course staff. Golfers were calmly redirected away from the affected fairways, and every movement of the herd was carefully monitored from a respectful distance. Watching through my binoculars, I noticed something that made me shake my head. The bison were behaving exactly as they always had on my ranch. They grazed, paused, followed the lead bull, and stayed together as a group. The only reason they had wandered onto the neighboring property was because the one structure that had quietly redirected their daily route had been removed by people who never bothered to understand why it existed. Around 11 o'clock, I received another call from Daniel Harper. His voice carried the calm confidence that comes from years of solving problems with documentation instead of emotion. The county has already forwarded preliminary photographs, he said. Between the wildlife report, the deputy's incident report, your insurance claim, the contractor photographs, and Rebecca's recorded admission, the timeline is becoming very clear. I leaned against the porch railing and watched a light breeze ripple through the tall prairie grass. I never wanted any of this, I replied. I know, Daniel answered. That is exactly why the documentation matters. Less than an hour later, an insurance field investigator arrived at my ranch. She measured the damaged entrance, photographed every broken post, compared them with the maintenance records my father had preserved, and reviewed the historical inspection reports stored in my filing cabinet. She seemed particularly interested in one series of photographs taken several years earlier showing the same gates directing the herd between seasonal grazing areas. These establish continuous use, she explained while organizing the files. That becomes important. Every piece of paper my father refused to throw away suddenly carried real weight. Across the valley, the wildlife team slowly encouraged the herd away from the course and back toward the open pasture using approved livestock management techniques that avoided unnecessary stress for both the animals and the surrounding community. It took patience, experience, and time, but by early afternoon, every animal had safely returned to ranch property. Only then did the investigators begin walking the exact route the herd had followed. Every photograph pointed back to the same place. The missing gates. Rebecca finally arrived at my driveway shortly after lunch. Gone was the confident smile, the press clipboard, and the polished speeches about neighborhood appearance. She stepped out of her sport utility vehicle, looking exhausted as she stared at the empty entrance. I did not think this could happen, she admitted quietly. I looked at the broken cedar posts still standing beside the gravel lane. Neither did my grandfather, I replied. That is why he built the gates in the first place. She lowered her eyes without answering. For the first time since we met, she was not arguing about property values or aesthetics. She was looking at physical evidence that could not be explained away by opinion. The county reports, insurance investigation, photographs, recorded conversations, survey maps, and decades of maintenance records all told the same simple story. Sometimes the smallest structure on a property carries the greatest responsibility, and removing it without permission does not eliminate a problem. It simply moves that problem somewhere everyone can finally see it. 3 months later, the new gates stood exactly where my grandfather had designed them nearly half a century earlier. Only this time they were built from reinforced white oak with heavier steel hinges and a small bronze plaque mounted beside the entrance. It did not celebrate a victory. It simply read, "Original alignment preserved in honor of those who understood the land." Every morning, I still heard the familiar creak of the hinges as the herd followed its established route from one pasture to the next. The sound reminded me that real strength is usually quiet. You rarely notice it until someone removes it. The legal process unfolded much the same way the wildlife officers predicted it would. The county investigation concluded that the unauthorized removal of a documented livestock control structure directly altered the established movement pattern of the managed herd. The insurance companies reviewed the photographs, maintenance records, contractor invoices, survey maps, recorded phone conversation, and official reports from every responding agency. Every timeline pointed to the same decision made on the same morning by the same people. Responsibility was no longer a matter of opinion. It was a matter of documentation. Willow Ridge Estates ultimately accepted financial responsibility for replacing the gates, repairing the damaged entrance, restoring the surrounding fencing, and covering the related property losses established during the investigation. Their contractors returned under county supervision to rebuild everything they had removed only weeks earlier. Watching them carefully install new posts exactly where the old ones had stood felt strangely familiar. The land had quietly insisted on returning to the balance it always preferred. Rebecca Collins resigned from the Homeowners Association board before the final insurance settlement was completed. The residents eventually elected a new board that reached out to neighboring property owners instead of issuing demands. A few months after everything ended, the new president stopped by my ranch carrying coffee instead of violation letters. We spent nearly an hour discussing fence maintenance, wildlife corridors, and seasonal grazing patterns. He admitted that most of the neighborhood had never realized how much planning went into keeping both the ranch and the golf course operating peacefully beside one another. That conversation accomplished more than every argument Rebecca had started over the previous 3 years. Sometimes understanding grows faster than conflict when people are finally willing to listen. Every now and then, golfers still pause along the edge of the course to watch the bison grazing across the valley. They stay behind the proper boundaries now, guided by the same gates my grandfather once built with little more than patience, experience, and common sense. Many of those visitors probably assume the view has always looked that way. They never see the paperwork inside my office, the photographs stored in filing cabinets, or the county reports documenting why those gates matter. They only see a peaceful landscape where everything appears to belong exactly where it is. I suppose that is the greatest compliment any rancher could receive. If a system works well enough, nobody notices it at all. Looking back, I never defeated anyone. I never needed revenge, loud speeches, or dramatic confrontations. I simply respected the land, documented the facts, trusted the process, and allowed the truth to travel the same steady path my grandfather taught me to follow years ago. The gates were never just wood and steel. They were quiet knowledge passed from one generation to the next. And in the end, the land patiently reminded everyone of something my grandfather understood long before luxury homes and golf courses appeared on the horizon. Justice does not need to raise its voice. It only needs someone willing to leave the facts exactly where they belong. Thank you for watching this story. If Ethan Walker's patience, respect for the land, and commitment to letting the facts speak for themselves inspired you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with friends who enjoy compelling legal dramas and true stories where wisdom and preparation overcome arrogance. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable HOA conflicts, property rights battles, and real-life justice stories. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next story about hidden documents, overlooked boundaries, and ordinary people who quietly protect what generations before them worked so hard to build. Your support helps us continue bringing these remarkable stories to life, and we cannot wait to share the next one with you. If you were in Ethan Walker's position, would you have rebuilt the gates immediately, Or would you have preserved the evidence and trusted the legal process before making any repairs? Tell us your choice in the comments and explain why.